They tried to get me to admit it. They put a gun on my chin and says, "We know who you are."
The year 2026 does not arrive all at once. For some, it approaches slowly, marked not by celebration, but by dates written quietly into court calendars, dates that carry weight, dates that represent decades of waiting. For some families, they mark the end of a long legal road. For others, they reopen wounds that never truly healed. Across the United States, men sit alone in concrete cells, each one bound to a specific day. Their crimes happened long ago, their trials stretched across years, their appeals moved through courtrooms, judges, and legal systems that rarely forget and rarely forgive. This documentary is not about spectacle. It is about time. It is about the crimes that placed these men on death row and the long silence that followed. Before we continue, if this documentary resonates with you, consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing. It helps keep this series going. Thank you for watching. Texas, April 30th, 1998. The story of Charles Victor Thompson begins quietly, without spectacle or warning. By the end of the day, 2 people would be dead, families would be permanently altered, and a legal process would begin that would stretch across more than 2 decades. On April 30th, 1998, Thompson shot and killed Glenda Dennis Heslop and Darren Keith Caney in Texas. The violence did not erupt out of nowhere. Court records later described a relationship between Thompson and Heslop that had been deteriorating for some time. Arguments were frequent. Emotional tension had become part of daily life. What had once been unstable eventually turned fatal. When the shooting occurred, law enforcement responded quickly. Investigators found clear evidence at the scene that left little ambiguity about what had happened. Both victims suffered gunshot wounds that proved fatal. Medical experts later confirmed that the injuries alone caused their deaths. Thompson was arrested shortly after. The case moved into the Texas criminal justice system, where prosecutors built a straightforward narrative supported by physical evidence, witness accounts, and forensic findings. At trial, the jury heard testimony outlining the events that led up to the shootings and the moments in which they occurred. Medical professionals explained the nature of the wounds and ruled out alternative causes of death. The defense later attempted to argue that medical treatment contributed to Heslop's passing, but courts would repeatedly reject that claim in the years to come. The jury found Thompson guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. For many, a death sentence suggests an immediate conclusion. In reality, it marks the beginning of a long period of waiting. Thompson's case entered the appeals process, where it would remain for years. His legal team filed challenges in state and federal courts, raising questions about trial procedures, evidence, and sentencing decisions. Each appeal was reviewed carefully. Each one ended with the same result. The conviction and death sentence were upheld. In 2005, during a resentencing phase related to earlier legal proceedings, the case took an unexpected turn. While being held at the Harris County Jail, Charles Victor Thompson escaped. The method was as simple as it was shocking. Thompson created a fake identification badge and presented himself as an employee of the Attorney General's office. With calm confidence, he convinced jail staff and walked out of custody without resistance. There were no alarms, no forced exits. The ease of the escape stunned officials and drew national media attention. For 4 days, Thompson remained free. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states searched for him, while news outlets tracked every development. The escape temporarily shifted public focus away from the crime itself and toward the failures that allowed a condemned inmate to leave a secure facility so easily. The search ended in Shreveport, Louisiana. Thompson was found near a liquor store, using a payphone. Officers reported that he appeared calm and did not resist arrest. He was taken back into custody and returned to Texas, where security around him was significantly increased. The escape became one of the most memorable aspects of the case, but it had no effect on its legal outcome. Once returned to custody, Thompson resumed the slow progression through the courts. His appeals continued through every available level. Judges reviewed claims related to evidence, medical testimony, and sentencing procedures. Each ruling reaffirmed the original verdict. Eventually, the case reached the United States Supreme Court. In 2021, the court declined to hear Thompson's appeal. With that decision, his legal options were exhausted. In September 2025, a judge signed the order officially setting Thompson's execution date. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice placed his name on the execution schedule for January 28, 2026. For the families of Glenda Dennis Heslop and Darren Keith Caney, the announcement carried a familiar weight. More than 2 decades had passed since the shootings, but time had not softened the loss. Every court filing, every appeal, and every update reopened wounds that never fully healed. Texas maintains one of the most active death penalty systems in the United States. Its process is structured to move forward once all appeals have been resolved. Thompson's case followed that path exactly. Long, thorough, unchanged. As the execution date approached, the passage of time became the defining feature of the story. The crime itself lasted moments, the consequences stretched across generations. For the families, justice moved slowly. For the courts, patience was built into the process. For Thompson, time narrowed from years to months to a single day written into a calendar. But Thompson is not alone. In this waiting, across state lines, other court systems is reaching the same conclusions. Different juries, different crimes, different victims, yet the same final destination. While Texas prepares for another execution, Oklahoma's courts are finalizing their own calendar. There, another argument escalated into gunfire. Another night ended with bodies on the ground. Another man begun a legal journey that would mirror Thompson's in length, if not in detail. Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, 2006. By the time Oklahoma's courts began finalizing their execution calendar, the pattern had already become familiar. A violent moment, years of legal review, and finally, a date that could no longer be moved. Kendrick Antonio Simpson's case followed that same slow progression, shaped by a single night that spiraled beyond control and never found its way back. In 2006, Simpson's story began inside a nightclub in Oklahoma City. What started as a confrontation quickly escalated. Witnesses later described a tense atmosphere, raised voices, and a dispute that refused to end when the doors closed. Instead of dissolving into nothing, the argument followed Simpson and the people involved out into the night. The conflict moved from the club to a nearby convenience store. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, and police reports would later reconstruct those moments in detail. Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones were present when the situation reached its breaking point. Gunfire followed. Both men were shot. Both would die from their injuries. Police responded quickly. The scene was chaotic, but the evidence left little ambiguity. Witnesses identified Simpson. Physical evidence placed him at the location. He was arrested shortly after the shooting, and the case moved rapidly into the Oklahoma County court system. From the beginning, prosecutors framed the case as one involving extreme violence and a clear disregard for human life. They emphasized that 2 people had been killed during the same incident, an aggravating factor under Oklahoma law. They also introduced evidence of prior behavior that suggested a risk of future violence. The jury listened to testimony from witnesses who described how quickly the argument turned deadly and how little time there was for anyone to intervene. Simpson's defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's narrative, questioning witness reliability and attempting to contextualize the confrontation. But when the trial concluded, the jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The death penalty was imposed. What followed was not immediate punishment, but waiting. Simpson entered the long appeals process that defines capital cases in the United States. His lawyers raised procedural challenges, questioned jury instructions, and argued that aspects of the trial should be reconsidered. Each appeal moved through Oklahoma's appellate courts, where judges reviewed transcripts, evidence, and legal arguments. Again and again, the rulings were the same. The conviction stood. The sentence remained. As the years passed, Simpson's case reached the federal court system. There, his legal team raised additional claims, asking judges to re-examine evidence and trial conduct under constitutional standards. Federal courts reviewed those filings carefully, but ultimately upheld the earlier decisions. With each denial, the path narrowed. While Simpson remained on death row, Oklahoma's execution system entered a period of uncertainty. Legal challenges, changes to execution protocols, and concerns over drug availability caused repeated delays. Execution dates across the state were postponed, sometimes multiple times. For some inmates, this meant years of additional waiting with no clear end. Simpson's case became entangled in those delays. Even after his appeals were exhausted, there was no immediate movement toward scheduling an execution. He remained on Oklahoma's death row as the state adjusted its procedures and calendar. It was not until 2025 that circumstances shifted. Another inmate on death row received clemency, opening space on the execution schedule. Oklahoma officials submitted a request to formally schedule Simpson's execution. After years of uncertainty, his name moved forward. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections added Kendrick Antonio Simpson to the execution calendar. His date was set for February 12, 2026. For the families of Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones, the announcement reopened memories tied to a night that ended without warning. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the shooting. Court hearings, appeals, and procedural delays had stretched the case across years that could never restore what was lost. For Simpson, the calendar now held a fixed point. The appeals that once filled his time were finished. The legal arguments had been exhausted. What remained was waiting, measured not in years anymore, but in months. Oklahoma's death penalty system differs in structure from Texas, but the outcome is shaped by the same forces: long review, reluctant finality, a process designed to ensure certainty before action. By the time a date is set, every legal avenue has already been walked to its end. As February approached, Oklahoma prepared for an execution it had not carried out in years. Staff training, procedural reviews, and legal confirmations moved quietly behind the scenes. Public attention returned to a case that had once dominated headlines and then faded into court records. But even as Oklahoma finalized its preparations, another state was already looking ahead to the next date on its own calendar. In Texas, the legal machinery never fully slows. While one execution nears completion, others are already scheduled further down the line. In a quiet neighborhood in Hurst, Texas, a crime involving children had left scars far deeper than court documents could fully capture. The case had moved through the system with brutal clarity, driven by testimony that could not be undone and injuries that could not be explained away. As February gives way to March, the focus shifts once again. Another name, another date, another story shaped by violence, loss, and time that refused to erase what had happened. The waiting is not over. Hurst, Texas, May 1st, 2013. The violence did not begin in public. There were no witnesses outside, no screams heard down the street. What happened on May 1st, 2013 unfolded behind closed doors, inside a home where children should have been safe. That morning, Cedric Allen Ricks entered a house in Hurst, Texas, where an adult woman and 3 children were present. What followed was not a single act, but a sequence of deliberate movements that turned ordinary rooms into places of terror. According to court records and testimony, Ricks armed himself with a knife. Once inside, he began attacking the people in the home, one by one. The violence was immediate and sustained. This was not a moment of panic or confusion. Medical experts later testified that the injuries showed repeated force, delivered again and again, requiring time, proximity, and intent. The adult woman was attacked first. She suffered severe stab wounds that left her critically injured, but alive. The attack then moved to the children. 2 of the children were fatally stabbed. The wounds were not superficial. They were deep, forceful, and targeted. Medical examiners later explained that the injuries were consistent with close-range attacks carried out over several moments. Not a single strike. These were not defensive wounds alone. They were the result of a continued assault. The 3rd child, 12 years old, was also stabbed multiple times. Despite his injuries, he survived. His survival would become central to understanding exactly what happened inside that house. As the attack unfolded, the child moved through the home, trying to escape. Blood evidence later showed the path he took, room to room, attempting to flee, attempting to hide, attempting to stay alive. His account described fear, confusion, and the realization that the violence was not stopping. At some point, the attack ended. Not because the danger passed, but because the damage had already been done. When police arrived, they encountered a scene defined by silence and injury. 2 children were already beyond help. Emergency responders focused on the survivors. The injured woman and the 12-year-old child were rushed for medical care. Investigators secured the home and began documenting everything. Blood patterns showed where the violence began and how it moved. The knife was recovered. Its placement and condition matched the injuries observed. There were no signs of forced entry that suggested an outside intruder. Everything pointed inward. Cedric Allen Ricks was arrested shortly after. Evidence placed him at the scene. There was no question of mistaken identity. The investigation focused not on who committed the crime, but on reconstructing how it unfolded. The surviving child later gave a statement that described the sequence in simple, direct language. He spoke about seeing Ricks with the knife, about trying to move away, about watching others fall. His description matched the physical evidence in nearly every detail. Investigators testified that his account aligned with the timing, the injuries, and the layout of the house. During the trial, prosecutors walked the jury through the crime step by step. They did not rely on emotion. The facts were enough. Medical examiners explained the wounds using careful clinical terms. They described the depth of the injuries, the number of times force was applied, the lack of hesitation reflected in the pattern of damage. Each explanation made it clear that this was not an accidental or impulsive act. It was sustained violence. Jurors were shown diagrams of the home. They were guided through the movement from room to room. They heard testimony about how long such injuries take to inflict. Seconds become minutes, minutes stretch, and during that time, victims remain aware of what is happening. The defense attempted to challenge the interpretation of events, but there was no alternate story that fit the evidence, no competing explanation for the injuries, no reasonable doubt about intent. When the verdict was delivered, the jury found Cedric Allen Ricks guilty of capital murder. The deaths of the two children met the legal standard for the most severe charge available under Texas law. In 2014, the court sentenced him to death. The appeals that followed focused on procedure, not innocence. Ricks's legal team challenged evidence handling, jury instructions, and aspects of the sentencing phase. Judges reviewed each claim carefully. Each one was denied. Federal courts later reviewed the case as well. Again, the conviction and sentence were upheld. Rulings emphasized the consistency of the evidence and the reliability of the testimony. Unlike many capital cases that linger in uncertainty, this one moved forward with grim clarity. The facts did not change. The findings did not shift. The outcome remained the same. Eventually, all appeals were exhausted. With no remaining legal barriers, the court set an execution date, March 11, 2026. For the families, the legal process could not undo what had happened inside that home. Time did not soften the memory of where each child had been found, the rooms they had been in, the lives that ended there. As the date approached, Texas prepared to carry out the sentence according to established protocol. Another name added to the calendar, another case nearing its conclusion. But the story did not end in Texas. Tennessee is preparing for a case that had begun decades earlier, a triple murder from the 1990s. 3 victims whose names had been spoken in courtrooms for more than 30 years, violence, years, and a date that refuses to move. Memphis, Tennessee, 1994. By the time Tony Von Kurthers stood trial, the crime was already years old, but its weight had never lifted. 3 people were gone, 3 families were left, with questions that time could not soften. In Memphis, the case remained a quiet presence in court records and memories, refusing to fade. In 1994, Morello Anderson, Deoy Anderson, and Frederick Tucker disappeared within a short span of time. At first, there was uncertainty rather than panic. Adults go missing for many reasons, but as hours passed and contact was not restored, fear took hold. Families filed missing persons reports, and investigators began reconstructing last known movements. Patterns began to emerge, names repeated, connections overlapped. Tony Von Kurthers became impossible to ignore. The investigation revealed that the disappearances were not random. Evidence suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The victims had been lured into situations where control was possible. What followed was not a spontaneous outburst, but a series of deliberate acts that ended 3 lives. When the bodies were discovered, any remaining uncertainty vanished. All 3 victims had been killed. The condition and placement of the bodies confirmed that this was a multiple homicide. The discovery ended hope and replaced it with permanence. Prosecutors later established that the murders were connected, not isolated. This was not a single decision repeated by chance. It was one course of conduct that required planning, movement, and continued intent. Each step offered an opportunity to stop. None were taken. As investigators closed in on Curthers, the evidence strengthened. Witnesses placed him with the victims before they disappeared. Physical evidence linked him to locations central to the case. The narrative tightened until there was no plausible alternative explanation. The trial began with a heavy atmosphere. Jurors were not being asked to judge a moment of panic or an act of desperation. They were asked to consider repetition. 3 victims, 3 deaths, 1 defendant. Prosecutors presented the case methodically. They walked the jury through the timeline of disappearances, the discovery of the bodies, and the evidence tying Curthers to each phase. Medical testimony confirmed the causes of death. Investigators explained how the scenes connected. The pattern was consistent and unbroken. Curthers made a decision that would later define much of the legal discussion surrounding his case. During parts of the proceedings, he chose to represent himself. The court allowed it after determining he was competent to do so. At the time, the decision appeared procedural. In later years, it would become central to his appeals. In 1996, the jury returned its verdict. Tony Von Curthers was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge imposed the death sentence. For the families, the verdict did not bring resolution. It brought endurance. Curthers' appeals began immediately and would continue for decades. His legal teams changed over time. Motions were filed, withdrawn, and rewritten. Arguments shifted from the facts of the crime to the mechanics of the trial. Central among them was the claim that Curthers should not have been permitted to represent himself. State courts reviewed the record carefully. Judges examined transcripts, rulings, and competency evaluations. They concluded that the trial court had followed the law and that Curthers' choice, while risky, had been legally valid. The case moved through the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals, then to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and eventually into the federal court system. At every level, the outcome remained the same. The conviction stood. The sentence remained. As years passed, Tennessee's death penalty system slowed almost to a halt. Legal challenges and administrative reviews led to a statewide pause in executions. Cases like Curthers lingered in limbo, legally resolved but procedurally frozen. For the victims' families, the waiting became its own burden. Every update reopened old wounds. Every delay extended a process that had already lasted longer than anyone expected. By the middle of the 2010s, Curthers' major appeals were complete. What remained were smaller filings that did not alter the outcome. The legal system had reached its conclusion. In 2024 and 2025, Tennessee finalized a new execution schedule after years of inactivity. Several long-standing cases were assigned dates. Tony Von Curthers' name appeared among them. The Tennessee Supreme Court formally set his execution date for May 21, 2026. For Curthers, the date marked the end of a legal journey that had lasted more than 30 years. For the families of Morello Anderson, Dayoy Anderson, and Frederick Tucker, it marked another return to the moment their lives changed forever. Triple murder cases carry a particular weight. They do not allow for narrow interpretation. They demand accountability for repetition, for continued choice, for the decision to proceed again and again. But even as Tennessee looks ahead to May, Ohio's calendar is already filling in June. There, a different case had unfolded inside a family home, a crime shaped not by disappearance, but by deception. A husband, a wife, a visitor who would never leave alive. Delaware County, Ohio. January 15, 2002. The house did not look like a crime scene at first glance. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, a family home in a quiet Ohio community, the kind of place where neighbors expect routine, not violence. What investigators would soon discover inside told a very different story. On January 15, 2002, Gerald Robert Hand called authorities and reported a deadly incident inside his home in Delaware County, Ohio. His account was immediate and confident. He told police that a man named Walter Loney Welch had broken into the house. According to Hand, Welch attacked him and his wife, Jill Hand, turning the situation into a sudden fight for survival. Hand said he retrieved a gun and fired in self-defense. By the time officers arrived, Jill Hand and Walter Welch were both dead. At first, the scene appeared to support a chaotic confrontation. 2 bodies, a shaken husband. A story that framed the violence as unavoidable. But as investigators began to slow down and look closer, small details started to pull the narrative apart. The position of the bodies did not align with a forced break-in. There were no clear signs that Welch had entered the home violently. The layout of the scene raised questions about movement and timing. Forensic evidence suggested that events had not unfolded as quickly or as randomly as Hand described. Detectives began examining Hand's relationship with Welch. The two men knew each other. This was not a stranger encounter. Prosecutors later argued that Welch had not broken into the home at all, but had been invited there. The implication was chilling. If true, the violence had not been defensive. It had been planned. As the investigation expanded, another layer emerged. Gerald Hand had previously lost 2 wives under circumstances that resulted in significant insurance payouts. While those deaths were not part of the charges, they became part of the broader context prosecutors would later present to the jury. The pattern raised uncomfortable questions. Too many deaths, too much money, too much coincidence. During the trial, jurors heard 2 very different versions of what happened inside that house. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated deception. They argued that Hand lured Welch to the home, intending to kill him. They claimed that Jill Hand became a victim of the same plan, either because she stood in the way or because eliminating her served a larger purpose. Prosecutors suggested that Hand wanted to silence Welch and collect financially from the aftermath. The defense told a different story. They portrayed Welch as dangerous and unpredictable, a man with a criminal past who posed a real threat. According to the defense, Hand acted in fear. The gunshots were a desperate response to an immediate danger. They argued that Hand never intended for anyone to die. To the jury, the case hinged on whether Hand's story could survive the physical evidence. Forensic experts testified about bullet trajectories, body placement, and the absence of signs consistent with a violent intrusion. Investigators explained why Welch's presence in the home did not resemble that of an attacker forcing his way inside. Each explanation chipped away at the self-defense narrative. Witnesses described the relationship between Hand and Welch. They spoke about financial disputes and pressure. Prosecutors argued that Welch had been demanding money and that Hand saw murder as a way out. When the verdict was read, the jury rejected Hand's account. He was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder. In 2003, Gerald Robert Hand was sentenced to death. As with every capital case, the sentencing marked the beginning of another long phase. Hand's appeals moved through Ohio's courts, challenging the sufficiency of evidence, the interpretation of forensic findings, and the fairness of the trial itself. His legal team argued that the jury had been influenced by circumstantial patterns rather than definitive proof. In 2006, the Supreme Court of Ohio reviewed the case in full. After examining the trial record and the arguments raised, the court upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. The ruling reinforced the prosecution's position that the evidence pointed clearly toward premeditation rather than panic. Hand's case then moved into the federal system. A habeas petition was filed, asking federal judges to review witness testimony, evidence handling, and jury instructions under constitutional standards. Once again, the courts ruled against him. The sentence remained unchanged. While the legal process continued, Ohio's death penalty system entered a period of paralysis. The state faced increasing difficulty obtaining the drugs required for lethal injection. Executions were postponed, then halted entirely. Inmate after inmate received new dates that were later delayed again. For Gerald Hand, this meant years of uncertainty layered on top of an already lengthy wait. His name remained on official lists, but the calendar itself refused to move forward. That changed in 2026. After years of delays, Ohio began assigning new execution dates despite ongoing problems with its execution protocol. Gerald Robert Hand was scheduled for execution on June 17, 2026. The date was set, but with an important condition. The execution remained dependent on whether Ohio could legally and practically carry it out. For the families involved, the announcement brought a complicated mix of emotions. The deaths of Jill Hand and Walter Welch had occurred more than 2 decades earlier. Time had not clarified every question, but it had confirmed the verdict. The legal system had examined the case repeatedly and arrived at the same conclusion each time. Inside Ohio's prisons, the atmosphere was shifting. Multiple execution dates were now stacked across the summer months, one case leading into another, the calendar filling with names that had been waiting for decades. Hand's case stood out not because of brutality alone, but because of deception, a crime that unfolded not in a sudden explosion of violence, but in a carefully constructed lie that collapsed under scrutiny. As June approaches, Ohio's focus doesn't not remain on Hand alone. Another case looms just weeks later, a shooting in Lima, Ohio, where the victims were not adults caught in a dispute, but children caught in the path of gunfire. Lima, Ohio, August 8, 2002. The shooting did not happen in isolation. It happened in a room filled with people, with voices, with movement, with children close enough to hear what was about to go wrong. On August 8, 2002, Cleveland Rayon Jackson went to an apartment in Lima, Ohio. The visit was not accidental. There was an ongoing conflict involving someone inside the residence. Tension had already been building long before Jackson arrived. This was not a surprise encounter. It was the continuation of something unresolved. Inside the apartment were several people, including children. The atmosphere shifted the moment Jackson entered. According to witness testimony, the situation escalated quickly. Words were exchanged, voices rose. The adults inside understood immediately that the moment was dangerous. What followed was not sudden confusion. It was a moment where time slowed just enough for people to react. Witnesses later told the court that they begged Jackson not to shoot. They pleaded for the children. They made it clear who was inside. They asked for restraint. It did not matter. Gunfire erupted inside the apartment. The sound filled the space, echoing off walls that had no escape. There was no room to run, no cover to hide behind. Bullets tore through the air in a place where children were standing only feet away. When the shots stopped, the damage was irreversible. 3-year-old Jayla Grant had been shot. She did not survive. 17-year-old Lenia Williams had also been shot. She would not survive either. Others in the apartment were wounded. Some collapsed where they stood. Some tried to help the children. Some froze, unable to process what had just happened. The scene was chaos layered with disbelief. Police arrived quickly. Paramedics followed. But for Jayla Grant and Lenia Williams, there was nothing that could be done. Their deaths were pronounced at the scene. Cleveland Rayon Jackson was arrested shortly after the shooting. The investigation moved rapidly. Witnesses were already prepared to talk. They described Jackson entering the apartment. They described the pleas. They described the gunfire. Their accounts were consistent. Prosecutors charged Jackson with aggravated murder, attempted murder, and aggravated robbery. The presence of children and the nature of the shooting shaped the way the case was presented from the beginning. This was not framed as an accident. It was framed as a decision. At trial, jurors were shown photographs of the apartment. They saw how small the space was, how little distance separated the shooter from the victims. They heard testimony describing where each person had been standing when the shots were fired. Medical experts testified about the injuries. They explained how the gunshots caused fatal damage. They spoke carefully, clinically, but the conclusions were unavoidable. The bullets fired that night ended 2 lives that had barely begun. The defense attempted to challenge parts of the case. They raised questions about who fired which shots and how events unfolded second by second. But the central facts remained intact. Jackson was present, Jackson was armed, Jackson fired the gun. In 2003, the jury found Cleveland Rayon Jackson guilty. The judge imposed the death sentence. As the verdict settled in the courtroom, the reality of the crime remained difficult to grasp. A 3-year-old child, a teenager, both killed inside an apartment during a dispute they had nothing to do with. The law treats such cases with particular severity, and the sentence reflected that. The appeals process began immediately. Jackson's legal team filed challenges arguing procedural errors, questioning witness credibility, and raising concerns about how evidence was presented. Each appeal was reviewed by Ohio courts. Each one was denied. The case eventually reached the Ohio Supreme Court, and once again, the conviction and sentence were upheld. Federal courts later reviewed additional claims, including constitutional challenges. Those efforts also failed. As the years passed, Jackson remained on Ohio's death row. Like many inmates, his case became entangled in the state's broader problems with carrying out executions. Ohio struggled to obtain lethal injection drugs. Protocols were challenged. Executions were postponed again and again. Jackson's execution date shifted multiple times as a result. Each change extended the waiting. Each delay added another layer of uncertainty. For the families of Jayla Grant and Lenia Williams, time did not bring relief. The loss of a child freezes moments permanently. Ages never change. Memories never move forward. Each legal update brought the case back into focus, reopening grief that never truly closed. In the background, Ohio's execution calendar began filling again. After years of pauses, new dates were assigned. Cleveland Rayon Jackson's name was placed back onto the list. His execution date was set for July 15, 2026. The announcement did not carry spectacle. It was a line on a calendar. But behind that line were decades of waiting, a crime that lasted seconds, and consequences that stretched across lifetimes. Jackson's case stands apart because of where it happened. Not in an alley, not in isolation, but inside a room where people had time to plead, where children were visible, where restraint was possible. The law weighed those details heavily. As July approached, Ohio prepared for another execution amid ongoing uncertainty about its methods. Training resumed, procedures were reviewed, the system moved forward despite unresolved challenges. Warren, Ohio, September 1985. The boy left home on his bicycle. That was the last ordinary moment. In September 1985, 12-year-old Raymond Fife rode away from his home at Warren, Ohio. He did not return. Hours passed. Then fear replaced patience. A search began, and what it uncovered would become one of the most painful cases in Ohio's history, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the decades of uncertainty that followed. Raymond was found severely injured. The damage to his body told investigators that what happened was not accidental and not brief. He was rushed to the hospital. Doctors worked to save him, but the injuries were too severe. Raymond Fife died from what had been done to him. The investigation moved quickly. Attention turned to two teenagers, Danny Lee Hill, who was 18 at the time, and Timothy Combs, who was 17. Witness statements, physical findings, and admissions would shape the direction of the case. According to court records, Hill made multiple statements to police that placed him at the center of the crime. Investigators examined those statements carefully, comparing them to physical evidence and timelines. The picture that emerged was not one of confusion, but of participation. The crime itself was not defined by a single act. Medical testimony later explained that the injuries were extensive. They were not consistent with a momentary strike or an accidental blow. The harm had been inflicted with force and intent. Jurors would later hear that the injuries were severe enough to leave no doubt about their cause. When the case went to trial, the courtroom atmosphere was heavy. The victim was a child. The details were difficult to absorb. Prosecutors laid out the sequence of events as clearly as possible, relying on testimony, medical reports, and Hill's own statements. The defense raised questions about responsibility and mental capacity. They argued that Hill did not fully understand the situation and that his intellectual functioning should be considered. These arguments would follow the case for decades, becoming one of its defining features. Despite those claims, the jury found Danny Lee Hill guilty of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death. Timothy Combs, because of his age, could not receive the same sentence. He was processed through the juvenile system and later transferred into the adult system as he grew older. The contrast between the two cases would remain a point of discussion, but it did not alter Hill's sentence. As the years passed, Hill's case became less about what happened in 1985 and more about what it meant under evolving legal standards. One of the central issues involved Hill's intellectual ability. Under United States law, a person who meets the legal definition of intellectual disability cannot be executed. Hill's lawyers argued that he qualified. They presented expert evaluations, psychological testing, and historical records in support of that claim. Different courts reached different conclusions at different times. Some experts believed Hill met the criteria, others did not. The standards themselves changed as the law evolved, forcing courts to re-examine earlier decisions under new frameworks. Another major issue involved the forensic evidence used at trial, particularly bite mark analysis. At the time of the original prosecution, bite mark testimony was widely accepted. Decades later, its reliability came under serious scrutiny. scientific understanding had changed. Methods once considered dependable were now questioned. Hill's legal team argued that this shift mattered. They claimed that evidence used to convict him should be reevaluated in light of modern science. Courts reviewed these arguments carefully, but ultimately ruled that even without the contested evidence, the remaining proof supported the conviction. The case moved back and forth between state and federal courts. At times, Hill received temporary relief. At other moments, higher courts reversed those decisions. The United States Supreme Court weighed in more than once, ultimately allowing the sentence to stand. Meanwhile, Ohio's execution system itself began to fracture. Problems obtaining lethal injection drugs led to repeated postponements. Governors delayed execution statewide. Hill's execution date was set, then moved again. Even in the 2020s, Hill's case remained active. Courts continued to review procedural questions and disability claims. In late 2025, Ohio's Supreme Court agreed to hear arguments related to whether Hill could introduce new evidence under a civil procedure rule. The decision did not halt the execution date, but it underscored how unresolved the case still felt after nearly 4 decades. Despite ongoing litigation, the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction listed Hill's execution date as July 22, 2026. For the family of Raymond Fife, time did not offer clarity. The victim remained 12 years old in every memory. The case returned to public attention again and again, not because the facts changed, but because the legal questions refused to disappear. As July moves forward, Ohio's calendar holds more than one name. Another execution date looms not weeks, but days later. Another crime rooted in domestic conflict. Another attempt that nearly added one more victim to the list. Hamilton County, Ohio, December 7, 1993. The violence did not come from nowhere. It came from a relationship that had already fractured beyond repair. By December 7, 1993, the marriage between James Derrick O'Neill and Carol O'Neill was effectively over. Court records describe ongoing conflict, emotional strain, and repeated arguments. Carol had asked him to leave the home. The separation was clear, even if O'Neill refused to accept it. That night, he went back. O'Neill entered the house without permission. What should have been a boundary became an entry point for violence. Inside the home were Carol and her son. There was no expectation of danger, only the lingering tension of a relationship that had not ended quietly. According to trial testimony, O'Neill followed Carol upstairs. The confrontation intensified as they moved through the house, away from witnesses and toward a bedroom. The argument escalated, fueled by anger that had been building long before that night. At some point during the confrontation, O'Neill produced a firearm. At close range, he shot Carol O'Neill. The bullet struck her and caused fatal injuries. She collapsed inside her own home, in a room that had once been shared. Emergency responders would later confirm that she died from the gunshot wound. But the violence did not stop with her. After shooting Carol, O'Neill turned the gun toward her son. Prosecutors presented evidence that he attempted to fire again. The trigger was pulled. The intent was clear. The gun jammed. That mechanical failure became one of the most significant details of the case. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. Court records emphasized that the attempted second shot was deliberate. Had the weapon functioned properly, the number of victims would have been higher. Police were called to the scene shortly afterward. Investigators secured the home and began reconstructing the events of the night. The firearm was recovered. Ballistic testing later confirmed that the bullet that killed Carol O'Neill had been fired from O'Neill's gun. There was no dispute over identity. The case was not built on speculation or circumstantial inference. It centered on intent, sequence, and accountability. O'Neill was charged with aggravated murder, including firearm specifications. Additional burglary-related charges were initially considered, but later dismissed because the residence was legally a marital home. The murder charge remained the focus. At trial, prosecutors laid out the events clearly. They described the breakdown of the marriage, O'Neill's unauthorized entry into the house, the confrontation upstairs, and the fatal shot. They emphasized the attempted second shooting as evidence that the violence was not accidental or impulsive. The defense raised arguments related to O'Neill's emotional state and background. They suggested that psychological issues and emotional instability should be considered during sentencing. Expert testimony was presented and evaluated, but the jury was asked to focus on what happened that night: a firearm brought into the home, a shot fired at close range, a second attempt prevented only by mechanical failure. The verdict was decisive. James Derek O'Neill was found guilty of aggravated murder. The jury recommended the death penalty, and the court imposed it. What followed was a long legal process that would stretch across decades. O'Neill pursued multiple appeals, challenging trial procedures, jury instructions, and the handling of mitigating evidence. His legal team also raised questions about possible intellectual limitations and emotional impairment. Courts reviewed expert testimony and psychological evaluations at several stages. Each appeal was denied. The case moved through Ohio's appellate courts and into the federal system. Judges consistently ruled that the trial had been conducted properly and that the sentence was legally sound. In 2013, the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit upheld the conviction, further narrowing O'Neill's remaining options. Meanwhile, Ohio's execution system became increasingly unstable. Problems obtaining lethal injection drugs led to repeated postponements. Governors delayed executions statewide. O'Neill's execution date was set, then postponed, then rescheduled. In parallel, O'Neill joined other inmates in challenging Ohio's execution protocol, arguing that it posed unconstitutional risks. In 2021, the Ohio Supreme Court rejected those claims, allowing the state to continue using its existing procedures. In 2023, Governor Mike DeWine postponed O'Neill's execution once more, but the delay was not permanent. After reviewing the execution calendar, a new date was assigned. James Derek O'Neill's execution was scheduled for August 19, 2026. For Carol O'Neill's family, the passage of time did not dull the reality of what happened inside that house. The crime was not distant or abstract. It was personal. It unfolded in a space meant to be safe. As the summer of 2026 approached, Ohio's calendar remained crowded. One execution leading into another, different crimes, different victims. Kingston Springs, Tennessee, January 1985. The motel was supposed to be quiet that night, a place designed for brief stops, temporary stays, people passing through without leaving traces behind. On a night in January 1985, Catherine Jean Jenkins was working alone at the Seaboard Motel in Kingston Springs, Tennessee. She was 54 years old, a routine shift, the kind that rarely makes headlines, the kind that ends the same way it begins. It did not end that way. At some point during the night, Anthony Darrell Dugard Hines entered the motel. What followed would not be witnessed by guests or passers-by. The violence happened out of sight, inside a space where Catherine Jenkins had every reason to feel secure. She was attacked. Medical testimony later confirmed that the assault was severe. Catherine Jenkins suffered multiple injuries. The attack was not brief. It required proximity, control, time. These were not accidental wounds. They were inflicted deliberately and repeatedly until she could no longer resist. When her body was discovered, there was no confusion about the cause of death. The injuries told the story clearly enough. Law enforcement immediately began treating the scene as a homicide. Investigators focused on reconstructing Catherine Jenkins' final hours. They examined the motel office. They documented signs of struggle. Items were out of place. The quiet order of a late-night workspace had been disrupted by violence. Anthony Hines quickly became a suspect. Evidence connected him to the crime in multiple ways. Investigators found that he had possession of Catherine Jenkins' car after her death. Her keys were also linked to him. A shirt recovered during the investigation contained blood that forensic testing later associated with the victim. When questioned by police, Hines gave inconsistent explanations. His story changed. Details shifted. He struggled to account for how he came into possession of the victim's belongings. These contradictions became central to the case. At trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence step by step. They did not rely on a single piece of proof. Instead, they built a cumulative picture: the victim's car, the keys, the blood-stained clothing, the changing statements. Each element reinforced the others. Medical experts testified about Catherine Jenkins' injuries using careful, clinical language. They explained that the wounds were consistent with a violent assault that escalated rather than stopped. The jury was left with no doubt that the attack had been intentional and fatal. The defense argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. They suggested that another man, who had discovered the body, should have been investigated more thoroughly. They questioned whether all possible leads had been fully explored. Despite those arguments, the jury found Anthony Darrell Dugard Hines guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death. For most cases, that would have marked the beginning of a slow fade into legal history. For Hines, it marked the beginning of one of the longest and most complex death row journeys in Tennessee. Years turned into decades. Hines pursued appeals through Tennessee's courts, raising questions about trial strategy, evidence handling, and the effectiveness of his defense. Each appeal was reviewed, each was denied. The conviction and sentence remained intact. Then, decades later, the case took an unexpected turn. In 2020, a federal appeals court ruled that Hines's original defense team had failed to adequately investigate an alternative suspect. The court determined that this failure could have affected the outcome of the trial. For the first time in more than 30 years, it appeared that Hines might receive a new trial or a new sentencing hearing. The ruling sent shockwaves through the legal community. After decades on death row, the possibility of reversal reopened a case many believed was settled. But the moment did not last. In 2021, the United States Supreme Court reviewed the decision. The court reversed the lower court's ruling, stating that the evidence against Hines was strong enough that the outcome of the trial would not have changed, even if the alternative suspect had been investigated further. With that decision, the death sentence became fully active again. Tennessee law gives inmates sentenced before 1999 a choice between execution methods. Because Hines was convicted in 1985, he was granted that option. He could choose lethal injection or electrocution. As Tennessee resumed setting execution dates after years of delays, Hines's name returned to the calendar. The Tennessee Supreme Court officially scheduled his execution for August 13, 2026. For the family of Catherine Jean Jenkins, the case had never truly left. Every legal development reopened the night she did not come home. The image of a quiet motel turned into a crime scene remained fixed in memory. Hines's case stands apart not because of spectacle, but because of endurance. A crime committed in silence. A conviction that survived nearly 4 decades of legal scrutiny. A sentence that came close to reversal before being reinstated. As August approached, Tennessee prepared for an execution that had once seemed uncertain. Procedures were reviewed, legal confirmations were finalized. The system moved forward again. But even as Tennessee focused on August, Ohio's calendar was already looking toward October, another crime from the 1980s. Another woman attacked inside her own space. Another case that refused to disappear quietly. Cincinnati, Ohio, March 3, 1985. The attack happened in silence. No argument, no warning. Only what followed revealed how violently safety can collapse inside a private space. On March 3, 1985, Mary Akoff was inside her apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was 26 years old. Her 10-year-old daughter was also home. Nothing about the day suggested danger. The apartment was supposed to be a place of protection. At some point, Jerome Henderson forced his way inside. Investigators later documented signs of unlawful entry. The damage to the door indicated force. Once inside, Henderson did not hesitate. He moved through the apartment toward Akoff, turning a familiar space into a confined trap. What followed was a sustained and deliberate attack. Mary Akoff was stabbed multiple times. Medical examiners later testified that the wounds were inflicted with repeated force. This was not a single strike delivered in panic. It was an assault that continued, requiring proximity and persistence. Blood evidence showed movement throughout the apartment, indicating that Akoff attempted to escape or resist. The violence did not end quickly. It stopped only when she collapsed from her injuries. Her daughter discovered her. The child entered the apartment and found her mother severely wounded. Despite shock and fear, she managed to call for help. Emergency responders arrived soon after, but the injuries were too extensive. Mary Akoff died from the stab wounds inflicted during the attack. Police secured the scene and began documenting evidence, blood patterns, signs of Struggle and the condition of the apartment left little room for interpretation. The attack was intentional, it was invasive, and it happened inside a place meant to be safe. Investigators also determined that the assault involved an attempted sexual attack. This element shaped both the charges and the presentation of the case. The violence was not random, it was personal and targeted. Witnesses reported seeing Jerome Henderson near the apartment around the time of the crime. Henderson lived nearby, making his presence immediately relevant. Police questioned him later that same day. Physical evidence strengthened the case. Clothing recovered from Henderson showed bloodstains consistent with the scene. His shoes matched impressions found inside the apartment. Forensic testing available at the time linked him directly to the attack. Henderson was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, burglary, and attempted rape. At trial, prosecutors reconstructed the crime step by step. They described Henderson's forced entry, the movement through the apartment, and the sequence of injuries. Medical experts testified using controlled, clinical language. Each explanation reinforced the same conclusion. The attack was deliberate and sustained. Jurors also heard about Akoff's daughter discovering her mother and calling for help. The emotional impact of that moment required no exaggeration. It underscored the lasting harm caused by the crime. The jury found Henderson guilty of aggravated murder, burglary, and attempted rape. He was acquitted of the completed rape charge, but convicted of the attempt. During sentencing, jurors considered the brutality of the attack, the invasion of a private home, and the trauma inflicted on a child. They recommended the death penalty. The court imposed it. What followed was a legal process that stretched across nearly 4 decades. Henderson's appeals focused heavily on forensic evidence. In 1985, forensic science lacked the precision available in later decades. His legal team argued that blood testing methods used at the time were unreliable by modern standards and should be reevaluated. Courts reviewed these arguments repeatedly. Judges acknowledged advances in forensic science but ruled that the evidence presented at trial was sufficient and that newer testing would not alter the outcome. The conviction remained intact. Henderson also raised claims related to mental health. Over the years, his lawyers argued that he suffered from serious mental illness at the time of the crime and that this should bar execution under Ohio law. In 2022, Henderson filed a petition under Ohio's serious mental illness statute. Courts reviewed medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and expert testimony. In August 2025, the Court of Appeals denied the request, ruling that Henderson did not meet the legal standard required to change his sentence. Meanwhile, Ohio's execution system faced repeated delays. Problems obtaining lethal injection drugs led to statewide postponements. Governors issued reprieves. Execution dates were set, withdrawn, and reset. Henderson's case followed that shifting calendar. Eventually, a new date was assigned. Jerome Henderson's execution was scheduled for October 21st, 2026. For the family of Mary Akoff, time did not lessen the trauma. The memory of a child finding her mother after a violent attack remained unchanged. Court decisions could not undo that moment. Henderson's case stands as a reminder of how quickly violence can enter a private space and how long its consequences endure. A crime that unfolded in minutes produced a legal process that lasted decades. As the calendar for 2026 filled, each date marked a different crime, a different loss, and a different path through the justice system. The year was nearing its end. The weight of what happened was not. The men in this documentary did not arrive at this point together. Their crimes happened in different decades, in different states, under different circumstances. Some acts unfolded in seconds, others stretched over long, deliberate moments. But every case followed the same long path afterward. Years of trials, years of appeals, years of waiting. For the families of the victims, time did not heal what was taken. It only marked the distance between the crime and the present. Courtrooms closed, files were archived, calendars moved forward, but the impact of those moments never disappeared. As 2026 approaches, the justice system prepares to carry out sentences that were decided long ago. These executions do not represent sudden decisions, but the end of processes that lasted decades. Every appeal was heard, every argument was reviewed, every delay passed. What remains now is finality, not closure, not relief. just an ending written into a calendar. If you made it to the end of this documentary, thank you for staying with these stories. And before you go, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from?